If you enjoy this type of content, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to be part of the community. Now let's get started.
The snow had been falling without stopping for 3 days when Teodoro heard the sound. It was different from anything he had ever heard in those mountains in 40 years of living there. It wasn't wind. It wasn't a branch breaking under the weight of the ice. It was something alive trying not to die. He stopped in the middle of the path, the flashlight trembling in his gloved hand. The cold of that night was the kind that penetrates the bones and erases thoughts. But that low, dragging whimper made Teodoro move forward when any sensible person would have turned back home. What he found behind the old quarry took his breath away in a way the cold never managed to. A German shepherd female dog was lying in the snow, her flank rising and falling irregularly. 3 puppies were pressed against her body, trying to warm themselves with heat she could barely keep. Her front paw was twisted at an angle that shouldn't exist, and a dark stain spread across the snow around her. She raised her eyes to Teodoro, not with fear, but with something he would never forget. It was the silent request of someone who no longer had the strength to fight alone. Teodoro was 72 years old, with a bad knee and a coat that was not made for temperatures like that. Even so, he took off the coat and wrapped the dog with it. No one in the village believed it when he arrived carrying her in his arms, the puppies inside the old backpack, the old man shivering with cold but with a strange smile on his face. The veterinarian said that 1 more hour in the snow and she would not have survived. The paw was broken, the body dehydrated, and the temperature dangerously low. Teodoro called her Frida right there, in the cold waiting room of the clinic, without knowing why. The name came, what no one knew, and that Teodoro himself would only discover weeks later, was that the dog had not arrived in those mountains by accident. There was something stuck to her collar, hidden under the tangled fur, that would change everything he thought he knew about that night. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and tell in the comments what you thought, and for which city or country you are watching. Frida stayed in Teodoro's house for 3 weeks before she could place her paw on the ground without trembling. He improvised a bed with old blankets near the wood stove, and the puppies slept curled up around her, as if they had never known any other place. Every morning, before coffee, he checked the bandage, changed the water, and spent a few minutes just looking at her, trying to understand what there was in that animal that made him feel that he wasn't as alone as he had thought he was. His daughter called twice during that period. The first time, she laughed when he told her about the dog. The second time, she asked him not to get involved with a stray animal. Teodoro calmly hung up the phone and went to prepare the broth that the veterinarian had recommended for her recovery. It was during Frida's 3rd bath that he found something he did not expect. Wrapped around the ring of the collar, fastened with a plastic tie yellow by time, there was a small metal capsule. The kind used to store messages in carrier pigeon races. The kind Teodoro had seen only once in his life, in a museum when he was still a child. He opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, a piece of paper folded into 4, the ink slightly smudged by moisture, but still legible. There were only 2 lines, a sequence of numbers and a name, Walter Brand. Teodoro stood still for a long moment, the paper in his hand, Frida shaking the water from her fur beside him. He didn't know any Walter Brand, but the prefix of the numbers, he recognized it. It was the code of a region almost 200 kilometers from there, in the northern mountains, where winter arrived even earlier and stayed much longer. He carefully folded the paper and put it in the pocket of his apron. That night, while Frida slept with the puppies and the firewood crackled in the stove, Teodoro opened the old map that had been folded in the drawer for years. He ran his finger along the lines of the mountain roads, through the nameless villages, along the paths he knew and the ones he had never dared to travel in his entire life. Someone had placed that capsule on Frida's collar, someone who knew she might not return, and that someone, for a reason Teodoro still could not understand, had addressed that message directly in his direction. But for what reason? Teodoro did not tell anyone about the paper. Not even the veterinarian, who still called once a week to ask how Frida was doing. Not even the neighbor Arvo, who kept showing up to drink coffee and comment about the weather as if he had nothing else to do. There was something in those 2 lines that asked for silence, and he had learned to respect that kind of request his entire life. For 10 days, he tried to locate Walter Brand using the means he had within reach. He asked the town librarian to search the old municipal records. He flipped through telephone directories that no one had used for years. He discreetly asked an old mailman who knew the northern villages like the palm of his own wrinkled hand. Nothing. The name did not appear anywhere, as if the person had never existed or had deliberately made sure to stop existing for the world. It was Frida who changed the direction of everything, in a way Teodoro could never have imagined. On a Tuesday morning, she got up before him, went to the door and stood there, looking outside. She did not bark. She did not scratch the wood. She just stood there, completely still, her snout pointed in the direction of the northern mountains, as if she knew exactly what was there and was waiting for him to reach the same conclusion. Teodoro watched that for 3 days in a row. Every dawn, the same thing. The dog at the door, her gaze fixed on the frozen horizon. On the 4th morning, he began to prepare the backpack. He put in supplies for 4 days. The map, the first aid kit he had kept since when he worked on infrastructure projects in the mountains more than 30 years ago. He also put in an old photograph that he had found inside the metal capsule. He had not mentioned that before because it took him days to understand what he was really seeing. It was a small and faded image of a child, and on the back there was a handwritten sentence that said only, "She knows the way." Frida watched his every movement in silence, sitting in the center of the kitchen. When he closed the backpack and looked at her, the dog was already on her feet, her tail wagging in a calm and resolute way. Not with the agitation of someone going for a walk, with the calm of someone who had been waiting for that moment since the beginning. They left before the sun rose. The walk took 2 full days. Frida went ahead, choosing the shortcuts with a confidence that unsettled any logic. At no moment did she hesitate at a fork or lose her steady pace. Teodoro followed her without questioning, his breathing heavy in the altitude, his knees protesting at every steep descent. But there was something about that journey he could not name, a feeling that he was exactly where he should be, doing exactly what needed to be done. Late in the afternoon of the 2nd day, Frida stopped. In front of them, there was a wooden cabin leaning against the rock, almost invisible under the thick snow accumulated on the roof. A single window lit, smoke coming out of the chimney. Teodoro knocked on the door with his heart racing, not knowing exactly what he would say when it opened. The man who appeared was older than he expected. Thin, deep-set eyes, completely white hair. He stood on the threshold for a few seconds looking at Frida, and then something in his face collapsed in a silent and absolute way. He bent down very slowly, embraced the dog with both arms, and stayed like that, without saying anything, for a time that seemed too long to be counted.
If this story resonates with you in any way, click the like button so I know that this content makes sense to you. And take the opportunity to tell me below, from what corner of the world are you following this journey?
It was Walter Brand. He was 78 years old and had been living in that cabin for 4. He told everything that night, sitting near the fire. Frida had escaped during a violent storm weeks earlier, when he suffered a fall and remained immobilized for days without being able to go after her. The capsule on the collar was an old habit from when he worked in remote regions and needed his dogs to be identified in case they got lost. But that was not all. The child in the photo was his daughter. She had died years earlier, in a winter like that one, in those same mountains. Walter had returned to near the place because he had never truly managed to stay away. And the number in the capsule was the contact of a shelter in the city where he had left Frida's other puppies, the same ones that Teodoro had raised for weeks without knowing that they had an owner waiting for them. The old man closed his eyes when Teodoro said that they were well, plump and lively, sleeping every night on the rug near the stove. Neither of them spoke for a long time after that. There was nothing that words could add to what that shared silence was already saying for them. Teodoro returned home with Frida 3 days later. Walter came along. It was not a decision that needed much conversation. When Teodoro said that the puppies were waiting, the old man simply went to the bedroom, picked up a small bag, and came back ready. As if he too had been waiting for a reason to leave that isolated cabin and resume something he had abandoned a long time ago. The two men made the journey back in silence, with Frida leading the way as before. But it was a different kind of silence now. Not the heavy silence of someone carrying a secret. It was the silence of someone who had finally let go of the weight. In the village, the puppies recognized Frida even before she entered through the door. The noise they made woke the neighbor Arvo, who showed up looking sleepy and ended up staying for dinner. Teodoro's daughter called on that very night, and, for the first time in months, he answered with the desire to talk. Walter stayed. Not for a week, not for a month. He stayed. He took the room that had been closed for years, the one that had belonged to Teodoro's wife before she passed away. No one needed to discuss it. The house was too big for one man alone, and the two of them knew, each in his own way, what it was like to carry an absence within four walls. With time, Frida began to sleep between the beds of the two old men, changing sides as the night went on, as if it were her personal responsibility to make sure that neither of them stayed alone in the dark. The veterinarian, during one of the routine visits, looked at that scene, the dog in the middle, the two men drinking coffee in opposite chairs, the puppies spread across the floor, and said he had never seen an animal with such a sharp sense of where it should be. Teodoro thought about that for days. Frida had not arrived in those mountains by accident. She had survived because someone chose not to turn their back. And that same survival was what brought two lonely men back to life, through paths that no map could have managed to trace. Sometimes kindness does not make noise. It just appears at the right moment, with four paws and a snout pointed in the right direction. If this story touched you in some way, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell in the comments what you thought, and from which city or country you're watching right now.